Hey, you're listening to the Sub Club podcast, a show dedicated to the best practices for building and growing subscription app businesses. We'll share insider secrets from the top subscription apps on the app stores. Let's get into the show.
Hello, I'm your host, David Barnard, and with me today, Revenue Cat CEO, Jacob Eiding. Our guest today is Eric Stromberg, the founder and managing partner of Bedrock, a technology investment firm with roughly $1 billion under management. The firm has made investments in companies like Flock Safety, Plaid, Cameo, The Athletic, and many more. Eric is also the founder of Check, the payroll infrastructure API, and Universe Software, the holding company for vertical fintech businesses. On the podcast, we talk with Eric about the importance of refining your pitch, how to build a moat in consumer SaaS, and why your month one churn might not be as bad as you think. Hey, Eric, welcome to the podcast. Wanted to dive right in and talk about your now famous screenshot essays. It's a really incredible format, and I just wanted to kick off the conversation. We're going to talk through some of the ones more relevant to the Sub Club audience, but just wanted to ask, what inspired you to create this format?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me. And now famous is definitely an overstatement, but I'll take it. So thank you for that. So I guess I'll start with a story that actually did inspire me on the screenshot essays, which is relevant to some stuff hopefully we'll touch on this podcast. In 2013 and 14, I was building a company called Oyster, and it was the Netflix for ebooks. And I had the very good fortune of having as a mentor this guy, Barry McCarthy, who most recently joined Peloton as the CEO, but prior to that was at Spotify. The first meeting I ever had with Barry, he's famous for going to the whiteboard. So he said, let me teach you a little bit about the subscription business that you're building. He went to the whiteboard and he basically explained to me this idea that as subscription businesses get older, as their cohorts age, the churn just kind of naturally comes down over time. And it was a very simple chart accompanied with 30 or 45 seconds of voiceover. And it actually just became something of a life of its own where, I took that idea and whenever I would be closing a candidate, I would walk them through that idea. Whenever I was pitching investors, I would walk them through that idea. And it was one chart on the whiteboard and then a little bit of a voiceover. And it really struck me, many years later that every business has something like this. Every business has to really understand the nuance, there are 2 or 3 things that you just need to understand it. It's one chart and a little bit of a voiceover. And so that was actually the inspiration for the first screenshot essay. Could I distill this idea that I'd been telling people so many times over and over down to one chart and 30 or 45 seconds of voiceover? And that concurrently dovetailed with kind of this feeling that I had was that business writing writ large was just kind of trying to boil the ocean. So could I distill something down to a minute or less? And I posted the first one with very little expectations, and people seemed to like it. So I kept writing them. I try to write as many as I can.
It's way better. It's better. Anybody's relieved at this stage to not have to read a thread. So
yeah, exactly. No threads. No threads. You got my commitment. No threads on the from me ever.
I probably saw your very first one and then have followed everyone since. And it's kind of taken a life on its own. So we'll link to this in the show notes, but you've got screenshotessays.com. I will say it's a little frustrating that they're screenshots because I couldn't copy and paste when I was making.
Don't.
I know. I do. They actually didn't start as screenshots. They started as, could I write something really short? And then it was 2 sentences more than a screenshot. I was I got to make this a screenshot. And then, I cut down, took the screenshot. I've gotten that feedback though. People are we want the text. Got to stay with the screenshot.
Yeah. No, you got to. But I do want to ask, what is your process for creating them? And so what I was going to say a minute ago was that I think the reason they really hit home for me and a lot of people, I think why it's really has taken on a life of its own is that distilling ideas and information down like that really is such an unappreciated skill, or it's you don't appreciate it until you see it, but it's such a hard thing to do. So I just wanted to know, do you have a specific process or writing short takes 10 times as long as writing long. So these things take you, weeks or how does that go?
Yeah, the process has evolved over time. I actually always start with the visual. So because I'm kind of a visual thinker, I like to think in charts and graphs and frameworks and stuff. And so I actually open up Keynote, which is my tool of choice to make those beautiful graphs in the essays. And I kind of copy an old slide, make a new slide, and just start thinking through the chart. And then I found that once I get the chart down, everything flows from there. Whenever I have writer's block, it's not writer's block, it's chart creation block or something. And then once I can break through that, I start to write around it. But all of these things that I've written about really are things that I find myself saying to other people, whether they're businesses that I've invested in, businesses that we've bought through Universe Software, businesses that I've built, these kind of core essence of what drives the business. And then when I find myself explaining it to somebody like 3 or 4 times, I'm like, okay, I should probably write an essay about this.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a skill you have to hone as an investor, sounding smart in like a 30-minute meeting, right?
Exactly. Exactly. We talk for like 10% of the time with the entrepreneurs. So when we talk, we got to get right to the point and say something impressive. Yeah. It's always harder than it seems.
I think applicable to our audience, and then part of the reason I wanted to talk about this is that, and I feel like we need to do this for Revenue Cat. Like we need to do a better job. A new product marketing manager started today. The marketing team, we've talked a ton about different kind of positioning things. And like, I think for most apps out there, for almost anybody listening to this podcast who is running a business, like try and do a screenshot essay of like what's meaningful or what's, what distribution advantage do you have? What's unique about your business? And boiling it down is,
if you guys want me to, if the marketing team wants me to do more content, just tell me if it's stuck to a size of a screenshot.
You're welcome anytime, Jacob. You're welcome anytime on screenshotessays.com. You're welcome.
All right. I think you hit like the 3 ideas that I have. I think you already wrote about. So like, I don't know.
Perfect.
I have to get creative, but yeah, I mean, it's true though. There's that like overused Mark Twain quote, like I would have wrote you a shorter letter, but I didn't have enough time. It's actually really challenging to write, and you have to be really comfortable not saying things, right? I think it's really, it's a really, you have to have a lot of confidence to be like, okay, I'm going to leave that out. I'm going to leave this out. I'm going to leave that out. I'm going to kind of assume that the reader's going to follow this, and they may or may not, right? It's a tough game to balance leaving out the context, but like still maintaining the overall point of the message. So
100%. And just to bring it back to, developers and those building companies, like whenever I write these essays, there's always points that I'm like, oh man, like I didn't want to cut that, right? But you do. And I think the same is true in building any company, right? Whenever you're pitching the company, again, to investors, to the press, to people you're going to hire, there's like 10 talking points that you talk through, that you speak through, and you see someone's eyes light up. And you hate to lose 8 or 9 of those, but often that's what you need to do, right? To really land the punch on the one point you're trying to make. And with my essay, I find that all the time. It's just, okay, what am I actually trying to say here? What's the one takeaway? Because in one screenshot, you don't have much time to jump all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's a great lesson for product development too. I mean, that's the constant battle. It's like there's 10 features you always want to build, and all of them are great. But what's those 1 or 2 you need to focus on right now?
Yeah, only 2 or 3 will matter. And most people can really only understand 2 or 3, right, about your product, at least in that initial pitch, right? When you're building a platform or something, maybe it changes.
And it's so painful as an entrepreneur because you're like, I spent so much time on these other 10 things. And like, maybe these other 10 things were so much harder to build than the 2 things that you actually want to hear about. Yeah. But I got to put that to the side, right?
Yeah. Well, let's dive into the meat of this then. I think it's one of the first screenshot essays I saw of yours, or at least an early one that lit up my mind, being so focused on consumer subscriptions myself, was the one where you talked about Duolingo, Bumble, and the rise of consumer SaaS and how it parallels B2B SaaS. So I'd love for you to give us just kind of you could almost read the whole screenshot essay and it'd be a TLDR because it wasn't too long to read.
Nobody will go to the show notes, David. Come on, growth hack.
Exactly.
So give us a little summary of your ideas there, and then I'd love to ask some questions about your thinking.
Yeah, for sure. And I'll put some context around it. It really was written as a rallying cry for those building in consumer SaaS to say, hey, I know people might be overlooking your business or underestimating it, but these businesses can grow much larger than anybody thinks. And you should have confidence in that. And so what gave me the confidence to write that is that I started my career in 2010 working actually at a consumer internet company. But at the time, I vividly remember that all of the oxygen in the room, all anyone was talking about were consumer companies. It was Google, it was Amazon, it was Facebook, which was on the rise. And in fact, if you as an entrepreneur said, I'm building a SaaS business, people would look at you and like one step up from building a lemonade stand, right? It was like, wow, you must not be ambitious. You're building a SaaS company,
I remember
right?
we had an SDK. I had an SDK company doing something not that dissimilar from Revenue Cat, and like all the advice we got was like, just grow your users. Like everybody was pitching us like if we had just
100%.
like slapped the SaaS fee on it, whatever, made it a SaaS company, we'd be in a different but yeah, totally.
Yeah, and it made sense. Like the data supported it, right? So like Google in 2010 was a $300 billion company. And then Salesforce, which was like the best SaaS business, after, 10 years of building, it's a $10 billion company, right? And then there weren't many even $1 billion SaaS businesses. And so like the data supported kind of the narrative that everybody was saying. And obviously, if you fell into that narrative, you just got it completely wrong, right? So fast forward to today, in many ways, the most interesting businesses of this generation are all SaaS companies, right? There's Shopify, Zoom, Square, et cetera. And so what people got wrong was that they were comparing two different types of businesses that were actually on different evolutionary timelines. And so the kind of internet giants of Web 1.0 came up a little bit earlier than a lot of these SaaS companies. And the SaaS companies came up later with kind of later built out infrastructure. So different evolutionary timeline playing out on different timescales. And so I made the comparison to consumer SaaS today, where SaaS has had the benefit of 20, 25 years of this infrastructure being built out, of companies building companies, or people building companies, and people learning how to build those companies. And consumer SaaS, by comparison, is just way newer. And so, Apple only launched in-app subscription in 2011. Like I know you all know that, but like a lot of people don't focus on that.
And a very limited audience, right? It wasn't really.
And then a very limited audience. And then
So,
Stripe, same thing around that same time, and Google the same time. So like it is new in the spectrum of internet evolution. Like it is very, very new. So the point I was making in that essay is consumer SaaS is on a different, later evolutionary timeline than SaaS. It should not be compared to it in terms of the overall market caps or sizes of these businesses. It should not be dismissed out of hand as just inherently smaller. We need to give it some time to play out. Let's check the receipts in 10 years when some of these businesses like Discord, like Duolingo, have another 10 years of growth behind them.
So I love that the goal behind this was to be a rallying cry, but I have to ask, because these are the things I think about is, B2B SaaS now, multiple $100 billion companies and lots of decacorns and like hundreds of unicorns, it seemed. But part of the reason for that is that you were creating a ton of value to businesses who aren't shy about paying up, to save employees time, to increase productivity, to grow the business. And so in some ways it makes sense, how profitable those SaaS businesses are. But I do still wonder, like in consumer SaaS, is it really that big of an opportunity? Like, are consumers willing to pay? Can we make it up on volume in consumer SaaS? Like, what are your thoughts about like how consumer SaaS gets to be that big?
Yeah, so I'll come at this from a few different directions. Number one is just the starting point, which is that consumer spending in the United States is like 2/3 of spend. So it's like greater than business spend, right? So you start there. Now, of course, there's a lot of things people are spending on that aren't ultimately going to be captured by apps. But just as a starting point, there's no inherent reason why consumer SaaS or consumer spend should be dramatically less than B2B spending. So that's kind of my starting point. I think the second point is the way these things play out over time, of how businesses can find a wedge and then expand into adjacent areas is just dramatically underestimated. And so if you look at something like Shopify, which today is kind of the hallmark example of a phenomenal SaaS business that has expanded, for the first 10 years of Shopify's life, it was SaaS only. It wasn't until 2013 that they launched payments. And then a few years later, they launched capital. And more recently, they launched banking and cards. Today, fintech or merchant services is roughly 70% of its revenue, right? And so if you had said in 2011, like what's Shopify going to become? How big can it be? You would really only be thinking about the SaaS opportunity, and you'd be actually missing the vast majority of the opportunity that they would pursue over the ensuing 10 years. And so part of this is so part of it is, well, consumer spending is the majority of spend in the United States. The other one is just the belief that I have in kind of these innovation cycles that I've seen play out many times over, which are entrepreneurs find a wedge, they then find creative and interesting ways to expand on that wedge through new infrastructure that pops up to enable them. And then there's this beautiful cycle between more applications being built, more products being built, more infrastructure being built to serve those use cases, and on and on and on. And so part of it, again, is just this belief that that innovation cycle is still in flight within consumer subscription.
Yeah. And, something we've talked about on the podcast too, and I'm curious to get your take on this, is that as a percentage of consumer spend on software is infinitesimal, it's tiny. So people do only, spend maybe, $30, $50, $100 a year on things like this. But at the end of the day, if you're going out to eat, you're spending $100, $200 on a nice dinner out, and if there's software to help make that a better experience, if there's a foodie app that
Yep.
highlights the best things to order at certain restaurants or gets you into wait lists and things like that, if you pay $60 a year for something like that, when you're dropping hundreds of dollars potentially a month on eating out, like it does seem like there's still opportunity to provide a lot of value to consumers. And then, like you said, go into these adjacent spaces. Like we just talked to Fishbrain, Lisa from Fishbrain on the podcast recently, and they're expanding out into other marketplace and other things. We're in a hobby where people spend a ton of money on fishing. So yeah, it's really fascinating. But what do you think about? So first, like, where's that extra spend potentially going to come from? Is it going to come from, not buying another meal by, paying for an app, not buying another outfit because you buy a outfit tracking app or something? So, and then the second question kind of tied into that is like, at what point do consumers kind of hit that subscription fatigue of not feeling like software is valuable enough to spend that much money, where subscription after subscription after subscription. I mean, you see posts on it all the time. So what are your thoughts on those kind of intertwined ideas?
Yeah. I come from this school of thought, which is the only way to fight subscription fatigue is to build better products that serve people better and in more complex and interesting ways, right? And so, one answer to that question is the very tactical, which I somewhat reject, which is, you got to switch everybody over to 1-year plans or 2-year plans, and you got to send more emails, and you got to get your CRM better, and you got to acquire better people, better customers on Facebook. Like that blocking and tackling will get you, 5 or 10% the way there. But what's going to really improve your business and kind of break through what I refer to as the carrying capacity of the business, which is basically when, churn equals new customers, and you basically start leveling out. To actually cut through that carrying capacity, you need to drive product improvement, right? And product improvement can be, for some companies, if you're a content-based business, it can be, better discovery, helping people find things better. For other types of businesses, it can be accumulation of data in some interesting way, and then feeding that back to users. So that would be like the Strava example. It could be expanding into adjacencies like financial services, or some combination of all of those things. And I would point to something like DoorDash, right? Which is actually, if you look at it, in many ways a consumer SaaS business, right? They started as a marketplace, and obviously that's the lion's share of their business. But you say, if you ask the question, well, how do you get a user to just pay you a little bit more in subscription fees every month? That's a hard question. If you ask, well, how can you serve them in more interesting ways? That's a really interesting question. And so DoorDash, they have a take rate on the actual orders. They also have this subscription product that has done very, very well. They then use that position to now actually, they're launching lending products for the other side of the marketplace, the actual restaurants. And so if you look at it in a more holistic way, as opposed to just how do you get people to pay more in SaaS fees or subscription fees, it really does unlock potentially order of magnitude increase in the kind of market share or the wallet share that you can get.
Yeah, I was thinking back to your analogy with Shopify, and I think Fishbrain example is actually good at this, but I was struggling to think like, for a B2B, the platform play makes a lot of sense, or at least you've seen it enough times, right? Like you build a platform, you have businesses have all these other use cases. I think for consumer, it's a little trickier. The DoorDash example is great, right? Because they have this these apps are like moving towards the direction of like the Chinese unit app for everything, kind of, because Uber Eats is doing the same thing. But then when I think of like I want to say average, but like your day-to-day subscription SaaS content base at, exercise, whatever it is, like you can think of any category. It's a little bit harder to draw the analogy of like how you move out. And I think that's I think one of the challenges, and maybe that's what we're waiting for. When you talk about this this jump from SaaS being the monsters now and consumer SaaS being the relatively like single unicorns or decacorns. And then when we look at them as $100 billion companies, that's the leap they have to make, right? Is like figuring out what that platform, how you do a platform play in consumer.
Yeah, and I think when a few companies start doing that, others will follow. And that's what's so beautiful about how these cycles play out, is that they're very efficient. And when Shopify figured out the financial services thing, there's, now in every market you have a vertical fintech company that's building, SaaS plus financial services for that specific market. And I'm excited to see that innovation continue to push on consumer SaaS. I'd say, to answer your question of like, yes, if like DoorDash, you can actually aggregate the demand side of any potentially two-sided marketplace, you can build a bridge to something like payments or some other opportunity. And so DoorDash did this. There's a company called Peak that has done this for travel. So they own kind of the demand side, and they've kind of used that to expand to the travel company side. Your average exercise app, you probably have to think a little bit more deeply about it. But certainly if there's lots of consumers using your app, there is demand there that you can potentially serve in a more meaningful way, and then use that to kind of expand commensurate.
Yeah, that actually is perfect segue into your next, and you kind of touched on a lot of this next screenshot essay is the hidden moats in consumer subscription. So yeah, tell us kind of the idea behind that one.
Yeah, so I mean, I love this one because it is the foundation of how I think about consumer subscription, which is that when I started my company Oyster, the first month that after we launched, I think we had about 15% churn. So I looked at the numbers and I said 15% churn, that seems really high. I then checked it against kind of what Netflix was seeing and what these at-scale companies were seeing. And they showed, call it 3-4% at the time churn. And I was like, wow, we must have like a really high churn business on our hands. And then I talked to a few other people who said like, no, that's not how it works, right? When you launch, you have an influx of new customers. Those customers, by definition, are very, very early in their life cycle. Early users churn at higher rates than older users. It makes sense, right? If you see value, you stick around and you're less likely to churn over time. If you don't see value, you leave early. And so comparing a business that is in the first month of launch to a business that's like 15 years old and the majority of its subscriber base is older than 10 years is just a complete apples to oranges comparison. So I outlined this idea to help consumer subscription founders really understand that one, if you launch and see a high churn rate relative to benchmarks, like that's okay. Like, expect it. What's more important is that you reach some sort of asymptote, which basically means at some point that churn starts to level off. And so maybe it's 15% in month one, but in month two, it's 10. So it goes down about 5 percentage points. Then maybe month three, it's 7.5, and then it's 7. Then, it's kind of starts leveling out and doesn't keep dropping at a linear rate. That's actually more important. And so that was the genesis of writing about it because it wasn't something that I understood as an entrepreneur, but when I learned it, it really gave me a new lens with which to think about my business.
Yeah. And it's, as having been on the other side, it can be very, you feel very weak as an app builder because the timescales that you receive that information, it's too long. Like you can't look month to month. You're living this life of being data driven and like you want to be measuring, like, are we improving this and not? And it's kind of difficult. Like you can over the scale of years. But sometimes you don't have that long, right? Depending on your funding timelines and things like that.
Which is why I always just say, look at the rate of change. That's really the only thing you can look at is it getting better over time or is it staying the same? If it's staying the same, you have a problem. Churn should be coming down over time on a cohort basis.
Yeah, it seems like that's kind of the important takeaway too, is for, and we'll be working on some benchmarks ourselves since we have a ton of great data that we can do that with. But it's to look at those benchmarks as cohorts, not as overall.
Right.
So when Netflix reports a 3% churn of their entire user base, that is kind of handicapping versus like if they actually reported on a cohort level churn, it would look
very
much more like what other consumer SaaS companies are facing.
Yes.
And then kind of the other part of that essay that you didn't quite get to yet was how over time, those users who don't churn continue to provide revenue month after month over month. So you start building up, and inside Revenue Cat, we have this chart that it's this like layer cake of your cohorts where ideally you're kind of building that over time. And we see it in our data. There's some apps where it's like the cohort will spike and then it goes to almost nothing. And then the next one spikes and goes to almost nothing. The next one spikes and goes to almost nothing. And you're not really layering on those retentive cohorts. But in a great consumer SaaS business, you start to layer those retentive cohorts where you get 2-3 years into it and you've had 50% retention year over year. And now you're making 50% on top of whatever you're growing that next cohort. And so now you have the cash flow to build.
Every cohort does that spike thing. Like there's no app in the world that doesn't have a spike and a fall off. But the best apps, it doesn't go to zero. And that's all you need.
That's right.
right? It's highly sensitive if how close it is to zero. But yeah, I mean, that's what you're hoping for, right? Versus B2B SaaS, where you don't get that spike and decay typically. It's a much smoother cohort curve.
And then as you layer that cash, part of the point of the essay was that you then use that extra cash flow for marketing, for product development, for R&D to actually continue to build additional moats.
Yeah, that's right. And this is why the at scale subscription businesses like Spotify or Netflix, or even a level below, smaller than that, like a Duolingo, they're actually very hard to compete with because they have these older subscription bases that churn at much lower rates on a blended basis. So call it 2, 3, 4%. And so as a new entrant, again, you come in and you're churning at 15% a month. You have to spend a much higher percentage of your revenue just to replace your user base every month. You have to spend 15% of your revenue potentially or more to replace it. Netflix only has to replace 3% or 2% of its user base. And so they have more capital to actually go out and do R&D to acquire better titles, things like that. And so it actually does become over time a very, very significant moat for the business that does happen to build organically. And so the good news for the founder or the entrepreneur is you have to deal with a substantially higher churn rate versus maybe an established incumbent right off the bat. But if you can overcome that, it actually just naturally, without you really doing anything else other than building your business, becomes a moat against potentially new entrants.
Yeah. And do you think this means that we're kind of ending in this like winner take all? Like are Calm and Headspace kind of too big to fail now, where like they just are going to own
too big to be
kind of mass
against,
market?
Right? If you think about not just Eric, when you were talking about the returning or replacing the churn. I mean, there's this other problem of getting people to churn in the first place, right? Like you have to invest in a tremendous amount of capital to even get to close to a scale. Like assuming that you're scaling via paid acquisition, but all acquisition is paid in some way, right? It just depends on the leverage you have. But like you have to build in to get to that scale. And like Duolingo, like I don't know what their subscriber numbers are, but it's crazy. It's by far the best language learning app, or the biggest language learning app out there. It's not even the best. Like it's fine, but if you go on like language learning forums, like everybody's like Duolingo, it's a good thing, right? Like it's not terrible, it's not great, right? I think there are other better competitors out there, like, but they have a huge mountain to climb to get close.
And I think with Duolingo specifically, I don't know what the retention looks like. I haven't looked at it recently, but they just have an unbelievable top of funnel, right? So, if you say to a friend, hey, I'm going abroad and I want to learn a language, I want to learn a little bit, just the thing that's top of mind is Duolingo, right? It's just the thing that everybody uses. And so I'm a big fan of analogies, but the analogy with something like that is they just, they're on a beach and just every day, tons of fish wash ashore, right? Just tons and tons of fish wash ashore. And they just have to grab a few of them, while walking down the beach leisurely, right? Whereas if you're competing with them, you got to go deep sea fishing and stock up on the gas to get there and spend the time. And, maybe you don't catch any fish, but that's really hard to compete with, right? That's like a competitive advantage of a different variety, which is they just have a massive top of funnel. And so to compete with them, you almost can't, right? You just have to do something completely different or or asymmetric or some new innovation that feels substantially better or different.
I mean, I was going to say, I mean, that when you think of the ecosystem just of language learning as an example, like I think there's probably a lot of second or third tier compared to the size of Duolingo companies that's supporting. Like Duolingo supports that ecosystem by bringing in casuals or whatever, and then people want to get more serious, they want to try something different and whatever. But yeah, like you said, like you'll have to do something to topple Duolingo. They'll either have to really drop the ball and like stop paying attention, or you'll have to do something like totally that they cannot beat, right? Otherwise, it's like, yeah, these and that's your moat point, right? Like the moat is very real.
What other moats do you think subscription apps can build with that cash flow? Or how do you think, when you're advising companies, like as they get to year 2, year 3, and the finances are looking a lot better, the cash flows looking better, where do you think the kind of key strategic points are to be thinking about and investing that cash flow into? Because, a lot of apps, it's like, well, okay, we'll just spend more on marketing and, we'll just like keep scaling. Do you think there's other places to kind of strategically build out these moats?
Absolutely. It ultimately comes down to what type of business you are. So for a content-based business, which I know is a very popular category to build within the App Store, I think there is a decision point that every content-based app needs to make, which is, are you a platform to enable other content providers to reach customers? So this would be the Roku example, right? Roku's not ultimately a content provider. They exist as kind of a choke point where they are rounding up lots of customers who come and expect great content, and then they want as much content as possible to be on their platform, right? They're an open platform. The counter to that would be something like Peloton, which so the flip side of being a platform is to be a content producer. So Peloton is a content producer. Netflix is a content producer, right? They produce content and they want it to be everywhere. I think it's tricky to try and do both, to try and build both a platform or a distribution choke point, as well as be a content provider, because you're investing in so much content, a lot of dollars. And the question is, well, why aren't you elsewhere, right? Consumers are in a lot of different places. They're not just on your app. Why don't you go meet them where they are, right? And that is fundamentally at odds with trying to round up as many customers as you want. And so, for the content-based businesses, I would first ask that question. Do you want to be a platform that enables lots of different people to reach lots of different content? Or do you want to be a content provider? And once you decide on that, it kind of dictates which strategy you can take for growth.
Yeah, we kind of talked about this earlier, but you kind of mentioned in passing that fitness apps are a really tough area. Are there any fitness apps? And you did already kind of mention Strava, but in that kind of a competitive category, are there things you see companies building moats and in ways that are potentially applicable to other subscription apps?
Yeah, so I'll give a quick plug for a company that the business that I helped start, Universe Software, we acquired last year. It's called Equilab, and it is the largest community of horseback riders, so equestrians. And I think it's a really instructive example where basically they built a product that did very accurate gait tracking for riders. And so people who are riding, they want to know kind of at a very detailed level what was happening with the horse at specific moments in the ride. So they basically built this. It's actually pretty hard to build technology to understand what was happening based on the movements of that horse. And so they used that one tool as a way to basically aggregate all of these equestrians in the world, and then went deeper into their workflow. So that's kind of the theme, is like you start with a wedge and then you go deeper in the workflow. So another product they launched on the back of that is actually a safety tracking feature, where basically when you turn that on, if there's impact, someone that you select is notified of that impact. So obviously when you ride a horse, you can fall off the horse and that can be really bad, right? And so what they offer is the ability, right, if you fall, someone gets notified. Now it's built more deeply into your workflow. It's not just a product for you, it's a product that you're using with somebody else. And so it makes it, on the margin a little bit more sticky. They then said, okay, where are these equestrians actually riding? They all ride at these horse stables, which have other people who are riding, right? And so, can you share what you did? Can you connect with your community at that horse stable? Again, going from a single player mode to maybe a double player mode to a multiplayer mode, getting much more embedded in that workflow. And so, it all comes back for me to just product. How do you build more product to serve that customer in more unique ways, more deeply embedded ways? And that would be one example.
And exploiting the niche you're in, right? Like not
That's right.
not just copying open Strava and be like, oh, I'm doing a horse workout at whatever. Like I'm doing the equestrian version of Strava, right? Like that's not going to work. Strava's for Strava.
Yeah, you have to exactly. And I think there's a lot of that, for better or worse, of just looking at what other people do and trying to copy it. You learn a lot that way, but ultimately it comes down to what your customer's doing, right? Like, you wouldn't get that safety feature by looking at, trying to copy something from Calm, right? Another one that they're working on is posture, right? So people want to have good posture when they're riding. Like that's just super unique and idiosyncratic to the market that they operate in.
Yeah, and you're making real champions out of your customers too. Let me tell you, right? When you're focusing on problems that nobody else has helped them with, right? You're going to create really loyal customers. And maybe who knows how big equestrian stuff is? I don't know how big maybe it's not as big as the language learning market. Maybe it's bigger. Who knows? But
It's not.
But if you still can if you can be that moat builder, you can build that Duolingo moat in that marketplace, go for it, right? Like that's going to be a great business.
Yes.
Yeah. You brought up Universe. I wanted to ask you more about that. So one of the things I love about your perspective is you're writing these screenshot essays, you can talk about this stuff, but you've got skin in the game too. So you're investing in companies through Bedrock.
Yep.
And now you kicked off Universe Software. You're actually buying and helping to operate these businesses. So give us a pitch, the elevator pitch on what Universe is and why you bought this equestrian app.
Yeah, absolutely. So we started, Bedrock, the venture firm that I co-founded, we incubated Universe Software last year, and the team operates out of Atlanta. The starting point for us was there's this business, Constellation Software, which is in Canada and is a $30 to $40 billion public company. The way they became that was by in the late 90s starting to buy vertical SaaS businesses. So at the top of this podcast, we talked about those businesses being really underestimated for a long period of time. They just started buying them in the 90s, and then they've now built up a portfolio many years later of hundreds of these businesses as the world has kind of shifted to appreciate them much more deeply. So we kind of asked the question, what would Constellation look like if it was started in 2021 as opposed to 1995? And we coalesced on an idea that basically there were a lot of SaaS businesses, both B2B, prosumer, and potentially even consumer, that were adjacent to very large financial services opportunities. So I talked about Shopify. That's a great example, right? Another good example would be something like Toast, which built the point of sale and has since expanded, obviously to payments, to lending, to payroll, these financial services that they were able to ladder into because they had solved this very, very complex productivity use case for their customer. And so the idea was basically, can we buy these software businesses, these SaaS businesses that sit adjacent to fintech opportunities and then actually launch those fintech opportunities? So things like payments, banking, cards, payroll, and lending on the back of the initial wedge that company has carved out for themselves. And so, one of our first acquisitions, I'll talk about it in much more specific detail, was really a prosumer app that primarily had distribution through the App Store. It's called the Point Fix. And they really became the leading software that micro SMBs, so call it 1 or 2 person SMBs, whether it's a barber or a nail technician or a hairstylist, they use for scheduling. So they block out their time, they share it with their customer base, and that customer base schedules an appointment. They do not do payments on the back of that appointment booking, but it is a very natural extension for them. And oftentimes that barber wants to take a deposit to reduce no-shows, so payments was very natural. So we acquired that business that was SaaS only at that moment in time, and we're expanding into financial services. And so the goal of Universe Software is to build a holding company of these vertical fintech businesses that all go deeply tailored to a need of a specific vertical. In that case, it's these micro SMBs, and actually build what ultimately looks like the 21st century version of a bank. So 10, 15 years ago, 100 years ago, if you needed financial services, you'd go to your local bank branch. We increasingly believe that small businesses will turn to their trusted software to serve that same purpose. And we're building a collection of these that go deep on a specific vertical to do that.
So where does the equestrian app fit in? Because you talked about a lot of aspects of why the equestrian app has a moat and how they're expanding into different use cases for that specific niche. But where's the fintech opportunity there?
Yeah, really great question. So what we look for is an adjacency to a flow of funds, and that can be payments or payroll. So on the payment side, it's invoices, it's appointments, it's booking, it's contracts, it's maybe even CRM and loyalty. On the payroll side, it's scheduling, it's time tracking, it's hiring and onboarding. And with Equilab in particular, going back to what I said earlier about DoorDash, when you can own the demand side and really have a great user base of demand, you can actually use that to build a path toward the business itself. In this case, it's stables, and most specifically, booking of appointments with coaches, payments for services around the horse, because often people who use Equilab will put their horse with a specific stable and they have to pay for services. And so I'm not going to go too deep into what we have planned, but basically we found it to be the most strategic entry point into that specific market was to own the demand.
And I'm going to ask because I would assume you know this off the top of your head. What do consumers spend in the US on horse-related things?
It's significant. So like we look for markets where we can see a path to 5 to 10 billion of GMV. And so, maybe equestrian isn't quite at that level, but it's very significant as it relates specifically. It's a user base that does not mind spending for this hobby that they are so passionate about.
Right.
I guess I never realized that was such a key part of your thesis was like the bridge into fintech and payments and things like this, which I guess makes a lot of sense. We're talking about these platforms, the transition of a consumer content driven, experience driven app into a more platform experience. Like, where else do you go? I mean, there's not a whole lot of other platform plays there. But I'm curious, seems like the problem that Universe is set to solve, but that's kind of a big gap for the folks that make apps jumping into fintech. I mean, I'm just
100%. And so this is why it's so interesting. And look, I'll say full stop, like, not every app in the App Store is right for this. So you're right. If it's a content business, like even the business that I built, Oyster, probably doesn't make as much sense. But you'd be surprised how many of these businesses actually do sit adjacent or maybe one step away from some point of transaction. And then once you own the point of transaction, it naturally does lead itself very cleanly down a path to at least banking, and then potentially things like cards and pay advance or invoice advancing. And so, but it's not going to be exactly right for everyone. One of the things that we do look to solve here is you're right. A lot of founders of consumer SaaS businesses or even SaaS businesses build it to a certain point. They built a phenomenal business. It may not make sense to go raise a ton of venture capital, but partnering with Universe, who acquires the business. And then actually, the other thing I'll mention is we do not operate the businesses. So we help, we support, we augment the teams that are in place to basically, as we call it, go further together. And so that idea of taking on financial services is daunting. And it is. Like I built these businesses. And so there are a lot of fraud and risk elements to it. Owning a master balance account allows you to have better terms with service providers. It's a daunting thing. And part of what we want to do is come partner with us, go, execute against that really ambitious vision, and we're going to help you get there.
So you probably can't talk too much to all the opportunities you see, and I would imagine you probably have ongoing talks with other apps in the space. But are there any opportunities that you see that you can mention in this space that you're particularly interested in?
Yeah, it really does come down to has the app developer built a product at the productivity layer? So we call it productivity layer is the SaaS part of the business. The financial services layer is payments and everything else. We look for a productivity layer, deeply embedded, deeply ingrained behavior that could be supported on a 10-year time scale. And so that's really important. Like if we're gonna pursue something and buy it, we want this to be something that someone could use for 10 plus years. And something like equestrian, if you're riding a horse today, you've probably been doing it for 10 years and you can do it the rest of your life, right? If you're a hairstylist or a barber today, you're going to be doing it in 10 years. So we look at the longevity. And then to the point I made earlier, we look for a strategic entry point. So that could be, booking is the most obvious example of it. Invoices, documents, those are all entry points to payments. And then scheduling, time tracking, HR, onboarding, that's all entry points to payroll. These businesses don't all exist in the App Store, but you would be quite surprised how many do exist in the App Store.
That's interesting. We were kind of coming up on time, so I wanted to give you an opportunity to actually pitch. I mean, I imagine there's some people in our audience who might be interested in selling to you. Is there, how should people get in touch, or what would kind of your pitch be to a founder who's kind of gotten as far as they want to go, but they see opportunities and might be interested in talking to you?
So one, reach out. You can find ways to reach out to us on our website, universesoftware.com. We have a lot of these discussions and can fairly quickly say in 15 or 20 minutes, hey, we think there might be a path here, or B, there's not a path here. But again, if you're a developer who has built to a software product used by some substantial amount of people that you feel is adjacent to fintech, and you can see it kind of transforming into serving all the needs of for financial services of your particular market, and you want a little bit of help getting there, Universe can be a phenomenal partner. The other thing is, if you want to do it and you want to just do it on your own and you want to learn, we're more than happy to have that discussion as well. Yeah, I mean, it's a challenging thing for apps in this category. Like when you get to the point of like maybe thinking about a liquidation event or something like this, you're probably not big enough yet to go public. There's not as many paths going forward. If you're trying to find an acquirer that has like some sort of topical match, right? Like, oh, I'm a book app, I'm selling to a book company. So like that's very challenging, right? Because there's not that many acquirers that have the same thing, right? So when you have something where y'all are more application agnostic, right? You have some like broad parameters. You can do a lot worse than somebody who actually knows these businesses. Or if you look at like a private equity, like a straight private equity, that doesn't care about what you're doing and like things like this. Like it's good as a founder to know these opportunities and options. And and I think it's really cool what you guys are doing. So thank you. And to the point we made earlier, like we're trying to lay the foundation for the infrastructure to build this industry, right? And it's one element of it. It's not right for everybody, but it's one element of it. And that's why I love what y'all are doing at Revenue Cat too. You're laying this infrastructure that makes it easier for these people to launch great businesses. And then, in turn, 5 or 10 years from now, maybe there's some new infrastructure that needs to be built because these businesses have reached a scale that, nobody ever envisioned, and they need new things. Yeah. I mean, you've got my gears turning now on like, what do we build next? Because and in some ways it reflects that journey you're talking about. Like I've sold on the App Store. So I've sold SaaS on the App Store. So it's kind of like, my game. And most of us here are kind of from that same background, but we definitely, we see a lot of businesses at the Point Fix is a great one. I don't know if we're working with them directly yet, but I've talked to a lot of these where
you will be soon if you're not already.
well, I've certainly talked to folks that live at this world where like there's a SaaS component, but then there's also a transactional component, and marrying those two things can be really messy from a infrastructure perspective, from a compliance perspective, like all kinds of stuff. And I think it's something that holds this whole industry back in a lot of ways, right? Because you can't use one payments provider. You have to like walk this arbitrary line that Apple draws. And, anywhere that there's like unnecessary pain is a great business opportunity. So we'll keep thinking about it. Yeah.
Awesome. I was actually just talking to Ryan Jones about this weekend. He texted me because he's looking at our Stripe integration, and it's like, what? You can't use metered billing, and with Revenue Cat and Stripe. I was like, well, if you look at the current kind of stable of businesses we serve, that's like a really edge case, because you can't do metered billing on the app stores. And so it's kind of forced apps into this very specific business model around subscriptions. But it's like, there's this whole other world out there that like we need to expand into, and that subscription apps can expand into as the tools to be able to do that on the web and to be able to push people out to the web mature.
Yes.
All right. Well, that's a great place to wrap up. It's just so many opportunities. Eric, it was so great having you on the podcast. We're going to have links to your website, links to the screenshot essays, Twitter. Anything else you wanted to share as we wrap up?
No, thank you all. This was fun.
To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast player. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time.